Can you guys see my my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll jump right in. I wasn't 100% sure about the crowd, and so what I did is we have a presentation. It's a little bit about my adventures in Silicon Valley, but then the latter half is sort of my do's and don'ts guide for startups. So based on my experiences, and so if I tell you something you already know, that's wonderful. If there's something new that I can tell you, that's wonderful as well. So I will, without further ado, just introduce myself a little bit. So I started my career architecting factory automation for Ford and General Motors. Somewhere along the way, I became the CTO of Providian Financial. I kind of worked my way up, and it's now part of Chase. But the reason why I mentioned that is because we did one of the first web acquisitions in history, really, because this was not too long after the web. And so we acquired WebCard, and so I was on the acquisition side of a startup, which then exited to us, and that was WebCard. So that was a marketplace for credit cards. So after Providian Financial was acquired by Chase, I got a package, and then I joined Cisco, where I was there for about 10 or 11 years, and I built an enterprise architecture consulting practice for Cisco. And so we eventually went to 13 countries. Enterprise architecture, if you're not familiar with the term, is the largest scale design of systems. And so we work with Cisco's top 100 customers, everybody from Bank of America to Telstra in Australia, in terms of their technology architecture, if you will. So I did that for a while. I then got an offer I couldn't refuse and joined Visa, where I manage enterprise architecture, user experience, and several other functions. But a couple of interesting bits is that I own the tech relationship to a small subsidiary of Visa called Fundamo, which is a peer-to-peer money app that's used in emerging countries. So that was kind of an interesting. And then my team did the due diligence for the acquisition of CyberSource, which was a pretty good exit for CyberSource. CyberSource is a payment processor. Their biggest customer is Apple. And so anything that you buy from Apple is going to go through CyberSource, if there's a credit card or any kind of payment instrument that's involved. So basically, I've sort of been on both sides, but then I decided in 2015 that I was going to start my own company. And so I became an entrepreneur in 2015. And LifeState is a digital healthcare startup, and we did an exit in 2019. So I then moved to Florida, and I've been here since. And so now I'm in fun. So that's a little bit about me. So let's talk a little bit about Silicon Valley. So I entitled this slide, "What is Silicon Valley?" Because much like Hollywood, Hollywood is both a concept and a place. And the same thing is with Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was initially some of the cities in Santa Clara County in California. You could say that it started with Palo Alto, but it was really considered to be Cupertino, Mountain View, and a few other cities around that. So since so I moved there in the 80s, that's how old I am. And since then, it has, for the last, I would say 10 years or so, it's the epicenter for startups has moved to San Francisco, which is an hour north of Santa Clara County. And so startups have displaced banking as a primary industry in San Francisco. And in fact, it's hard to go any place, any restaurant, any event where you're not hearing literally startup conversations happening all around you all the time. And so it's this weird kind of a mix of what formerly was more of a European feel city into kind of this startup um, place, and it's kind of mixed together. So the South Bay, or i.e. Santa Clara County, is still full of technology companies, but what we would call big tech. So it's the Ciscos of the world. Any of the big tech companies are kind of located in the South Bay, and all the emerging technologies, all the new startups, early stage companies are more in San Francisco. And one of the reasons for that change was, quite frankly, a lot of people who started startups wanted to live in a cool city. So it kind of started first with the startups happening in the South Bay, and then they would live and actually do a commute to San Francisco every day. But then they decided to start moving the companies into San Francisco. Again, that was kind of the cool place. It's the big city. There's a lot of things to do. It's a beautiful city. And so the startup has moved to San Francisco. Key growth of the US economy, as you probably know, for the last dozen or years or so, has been driven by just a half a dozen companies. Sometimes referred to as the FANG companies: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. And those companies are either headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area or in Seattle. So in fact, 1/3 of all technology investments in the United States are done in the San Francisco Bay Area, and around a quarter of all technology investments are actually spent in the 49 square miles of San Francisco, the city itself. So there is a lot of money and a lot of activities there. In fact, if the Bay Area were a country, it would be the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world, with California as a whole now being around would be the 5th largest economy in the world. So there's a lot there in them there hills. One interesting fact that I learned just maybe 6 months ago is that 1 in 11,000 citizens of San Francisco is a billionaire. So there's a lot of money there. But it's kind of interesting in that, compared to, let's say, Miami or whatever, they don't really wear it on their sleeve. They don't have the fancy cars. You don't see that many Lamborghinis or, Bentleys or any of that stuff. You see a little bit of it when you get to the South Bay and on the peninsula between the two. But for the most part, you would not know that you're sitting not next to a billionaire. So now the bad news is the average cost for a home as of this month is $1.9 million. The average rent is about $3,500 a month, and that's for a small studio. And the cost to a business for a developer on average is $175 an hour. So now the developer, himself or herself, is making probably as much as $100 an hour, which is pretty good wage, but considering the cost of living, that is, that's good money, but not great money. And the cost of real estate is so expensive that you are living well, except for your living conditions. One of the things that's also bad news for old timers like me is that used to, any place you would eat in San Francisco was great food, and I'm a foodie. So now it's not necessarily assured, because we have too many people that have come in with lower standards on food, and so you can't be guaranteed of a great meal every time you go out and eat. So that's kind of Silicon Valley in a nutshell. So now, why is Silicon Valley special? This is kind of interesting. There are literally, being kind of a member of the community, of the ecosystem in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, we would literally entertain dozens of groups from other states and countries who would send delegations to San Francisco to try to figure out what the magic was, and then try to make it their own. And the one story I like to give is that we actually had a high-level group that came from France, and it was actually supported by President Macron. And this delegation came over, and they wanted to understand what makes San Francisco what it is, and so forth. And they made it very clear that they were going to make it their own, though. And I said, well, what do you mean by make it your own? well, we don't really want to work more than 35 hours a week. And me and my colleagues, we kind of chuckled a little bit, kind of under our breath. There's no way they're going to be successful, because one of the things as a startup is you're not going to work just 35 hours a week and expect to be successful. So if I had to distill what makes San Francisco and Silicon Valley, the concept magical, what makes it work, my best guess is there are three things. The culture values intelligence, particularly STEM. If you go to a high school in wherever you live, and people laugh at the kids who are in the computer science club, that's probably not a good culture. Contrast that with the Bay Area. And if you're part of the computer science club, or you're a computer science major, et cetera, you are well respected by your colleagues. And so it's just well regarded as part of the cultural values to be intelligent, and particularly with STEM. And of course, it helps that we have two world-class universities, both Stanford and UC Berkeley, but many other higher institutions. So it values intelligence. Number two, I think, is part of the magic formula, is that the Bay Area is very open-minded. They're very open to crazy ideas and differences in people. Now, there are some extremes, like my favorite crazy idea for a startup was the one called Yo. And I don't know if any of you guys have heard of it. And it was a messaging app that literally did one thing: sent the word yo to people. So it was kind of a way of connecting with your friends and saying hi without having to get into an in-depth conversation. And based on that MVP app, they raised $1 million. And so there's also crazy money spent sometimes. And then there's some other ideas that don't get any money. And, it just happens. In terms of the differences in people are welcome, there is really a mishmash of people. I would say that based on my own experience, there's probably a third of all the people that I ran into in the ecosystem that were not native born Americans. And I say that because there are a lot of accents. I was dealing with a lot of accents a lot of the time. And that in turn creates even more diversity. So we have a very, very diverse, very open kind of a culture. And I think that's number two. And then number three is, and this takes time to build, is that there's a great ecosystem for startups. And I call it the three-legged stool. We have the ideas, we have the money, and we have the people to build it. So you also have support functions, like you have world-class legal support, you have lots and lots and lots of support groups, meetup groups, and so forth and so on. So it's teeming with activity, and hopefully Tech Hub and this whole group of people, we can help make the Tri-County area of Southern Florida take some of these best practices and make that happen. So that's kind of the biggest part of the Silicon Valley. And let me tell you about what I've learned. And these are things, like I say, you may already know, and that's great. And if you don't know, that's great too. So lesson one is what I've learned. Don't talk about your hammer, talk about the wood that you can connect. So as an investor now, I hear a lot about people's solutions. But the number one thing that I got when I would talk to a VC or an investor when I was on the startup side, and then being on the acquisition side as well, people talk about their solution and not the problem they're trying to solve. And here's one great example from my company. So when I first started, I would say, we have a device where people can report on how they're feeling, okay? And I was so proud of that product and this market space that we were going to fill with that. And then I would say that, and then I would have a VC say, okay, that's great. Now, tell me what is the product that you are working on. So I would say, we have a device where people can report on how they're feeling. And he would say again, oh, that's great. Tell me on the product that you're, and so forth and so we would just go in circles. So one of the things that I learned is talk about the problem you're trying to solve. So then I switched it to, we provide clinicians with real-time data on how their patients are feeling. Then after a little bit more time, I might say, and can predict outcomes. Huge difference. And then I started getting money. So because what I'm doing is I'm, first of all, stating a problem instead of a solution. And I'm doing it in a way that people can understand, and it's very concise. So the conclusion or the end of lesson 1 is, you and your entire team should know that elevator pitch. Every time you brush your teeth in the morning, you're rehearsing it. And it might be the difference of what makes you successful versus not. Is that one elevator pitch that can be said in.
I'm so sorry. I don't know why I'm laughing.
Okay.
I just laugh at shit like that. Sorry.
So we got some.
Monica, I think you're
going to mute.
You got unmuted. There you go.
I got her.
Got it. Thanks. I couldn't do it. I tried.
So
right, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Paul.
Let me go to lesson number 2, which is you're always pitching. So the guy next to you at the baseball game might ask, so what do you do, Tahl? And you should be able to say, well, I have a company that does, and then you talk about your elevator pitch. You never know, it could be an investment banker who got tickets from his sister-in-law, and that's why he's sitting next to you in the cheap seats. So you never know. Just one example, I was at a conference standing in line to get food at lunchtime. And I just started a casual conversation with the guy in line. Well, that guy happened to be partner acquisition for Salesforce. Okay, and before you know it, I had meetings with Salesforce. They said, hey, have you thought about, coming on? And I actually interviewed at Salesforce, and I went through weeks of interviews and so forth, but I decided it wasn't right for me. But that was an example about, you never know when you will run into somebody, but I had that pitch down. I knew exactly what it is that I'm trying to do. In an open pitch meeting, and there's lots of those in San Francisco, you're not just raising money. In fact, there's always 3 things that you're trying to solicit. You're trying to solicit money with your pitch, you're trying to find future colleagues, and you're trying to find future customers. So I went to a pitch meeting for LifeState. We had only 4 minutes. It's rapid action. You get up there, you talk about your startup, you get 4 minutes. I did a pitch at a meeting, and at the end of my pitch, I had a guy come up to me who ended up being my chief science officer. He had a PhD in effective neuropsychology, and he had an undergrad from Caltech in physics. Who knew that there would be an effective neurologist, exactly what I needed. In fact, I didn't even know I needed it, that happened to be in the audience. So he became my chief science officer for all of like a month before Google snatched him up. So again, you never know, but you're always looking for money, colleagues, and customers. So just as general tips, and I apologize to anybody on the phone that I've talked to in the last few weeks that have made these mistakes. So please don't talk about your app. So I hear all the time about people saying, oh, I have an app that does this, I have an app that does that. Apps are not products, they're user interfaces. So that's one of the things that I would coach startups on. The second one, and this is one that happens with enterprise software sales as well, and it's really bad. It happens with startups as well, is to talk about benefits. Now, that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but way too often, benefits have been boiled down into something that's so unidentifiable that it's no longer useful. Like, we can save you money. We can make you run your business faster. That's a benefit statement, but it doesn't really convince anybody of anything, because first of all, they don't have a relationship with you, and they don't necessarily trust you, and they don't know what you mean. So explain the problem, explain the solution, and the benefits should be obvious. If it's not obvious, with some rare exceptions, then you haven't explained the problem or the solution adequately. Okay. Number three is to know what you're talking about. Just 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a startup. I was talking to the marketing guy of the startup, and he was telling me about how a particular compute platform was not powerful enough. He was saying, "Oh, we can't use Raspberry Pis. We have to use a full, a full computer." And he didn't know what he was talking about. So, and he was maybe repeating what he heard from his CTO, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure where he got the information he got, but please, don't talk about things that you're not certain of. Okay. So number four is that unless your product is a particle accelerator, the average person should understand what it is. You should be able to explain it to your mother or to your neighbor down the block or whatever, with some rare exceptions. So, and then the last one is, of course, universal communication practices apply. Again, I talked to a startup 2 weeks ago. He was a non-technical founder talking about his technology, and he was kind of dismissive. So I was thinking, boy, you should probably get some coaching on how to talk to potential investors, because, just can't be dismissive like, we have the ML, we have this, we have that, and so forth. And by the way, try to stay away from buzzwords. There's another startup I talked to a few weeks ago, and literally their website is all over it. It has everything blockchain, machine learning, AI, it has everything thrown in, just like, and I'm thinking, what does home automation need blockchain? Maybe, but you haven't convinced me, and I would just kind of take it off your website, really, because it's just kind of a turnoff. So again, sorry if there's anybody. So this is my last slide. So know how to talk to money people. So again, I'm kind of on the investor side now, and even when I was in enterprise, I was kind of on the acquisition side. You should always have your technical founder talk to, particularly like the VCs, if at all possible. If you are not a technical founder, then you're welcome to talk, but also bring your technical people with you. So if you're the CEO and not technical, you need to at least know the industry context for your technology well. Otherwise, my general suggestion is kind of step out of the way. They're brutal in Silicon Valley for non-technical founders. So non-technical founders come up there, they need to be MBAs, or they know the industry, they know business so well that they're impressive, but otherwise they get eaten alive, really. Number two is to know when to stop talking. And I will give a shout out to somebody I think that's on the phone, which is Virtual Badge. I went to an investor pitch this last week, and he did an awesome job. So George's, kudos to you. You know when to stop talking. So you'd be surprised about how somebody will ask, an investor will ask a question, and they go on and on and on and on, where a nickel answer is better than a dollar explanation. Number three is understand that the investment being made is more about you than the product. And in fact, if I talk to the investors on Sand Hill Road, and by the way, Sand Hill Road, which leads between Highway 280 and Stanford University in the Bay Area, probably has more billionaires per square inch than any other place in the world. It is literally where all the high-end VCs are at. And they will tell you there's two things that they're interested in when they talk to a founder. That they come across as very smart and they work very hard. Oh, by the way, you should probably have some idea about a product, but it's really more about you, honestly, than the product. And I've gone to pitch meetings where the investor that came across as smart and a hard worker were able to get the money, and the people with the great idea did not. So, just FYI. Before any meeting or product launch, examine the priorities. What I always recommend is you work from the outside in. Your website, your pitch deck, your LinkedIn, all that needs to look wonderful. I talked to a startup today, actually, where their website is not very good. Their LinkedIn, none of the people working for it are linked into their company. But they got that last feature on their product, which is unfortunate because if I can't fund the whole thing, I might send that link off or that pitch deck off to somebody else who could. And if it's not ready to go, then there's not anything I can do about it. So that's one thing. Start with the outside in. You need to look at sometimes before the inside's good. If there's something you don't know about, you can't answer, then you're not ready. And I'll tell you the two things that I hear more often than not, people not being ready. And one is their competition. And the second one is, well, I would say the competition is probably the main one. And so you need to be able to respond with deep knowledge about how your competition stacks up and to be very honest about why you are different than that. I just got two more things here. One is to think about your dollars. So come up with a realistic valuation of your company, be able to justify it, and then ask for the right amount of money. Sometimes there's one startup I'm working with right now. They're asking for too much money. And so I'm an eager investor, but I have to bow out because it's just like it looks good, but they're asking for too much money, and it's just not gonna happen. So if you ask for too much, that could happen. And if you ask for too little, of course, you could run out of money too soon. So, and then the last thing that I'll say is that a book that I strongly recommend, if you haven't already read it, called Get Backed, and it's by Evan and Evan. Definitely recommend it. What I've talked about today would override that. If there's anything in there, I would say, yeah. Okay, so that's it. That was my presentation. So any questions by anybody? I was very brutally frank, and that's what we do in Silicon Valley. But any questions? I would love to answer anything.
That was awesome. Thanks. Thanks for the honesty. I think that's what people need. They need to understand where they need to be and where they need to prepare before they step up to bat. I think that's a big part of it. So yeah, I'll just jump in with questions. I don't know that there's